Welcome back to the Wilson Center Africa Program's podcast, Beyond a Single Story. My name is Oge and Witney, and I'm joined by my co-host, Whitney Schneidman. On this episode, we are excited to welcome the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Wamkele Mene. Since 2020, Wamkele Mene has led the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, as well as strategic collaboration, stakeholder engagement, and resource mobilization for the implementation of the agreement. With Wamkele, we discussed the future of African trade and markets. We talked about how the African Continental Free Trade Area is set to become the largest regional trade area in the world. And we discussed how countries like the US can partner, advance, and benefit from the African Free Trade Area. And now, our conversation with Secretary General Wamkele Mene. Wamkele, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
So we're going to dive right into the conversation, and let's do a little bit of scene setting, because we talk so much about the African Continental Free Trade Area. We know not everyone knows about what the AfCFTA is. So help us set a scene here. Give us an overview of what the African Continental Free Trade Area is. Where do current implementations stand? And what are your goals for the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Well, thank you very much. Again, let me start with the latter part of your question. The goal is very, very simple: to create a single market in Africa and to create a single rulebook for trade and investment. For the last almost 70 years now, the fragmentation on the continent of Africa has been getting more and more entrenched. And an example of that, if you are in Nigeria, you want to trade with somebody in Kenya, you have to use WTO rules to trade amongst African countries. This was the extent of the fragmentation that existed and that still exists to some degree. So the AfCFTA is intended to reverse all of that, to overcome all of that, to create a single market. And that single market includes trade in services, trade in goods, investment, the digital economy, intellectual property rights, and so on. As we speak today, there are 48 countries that have ratified the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. Soon there will be a 49th country, that is Madagascar. And so in less than 6 years, we've been able, through political will of our heads of states, we have moved rapidly in ratifications. And ratification, as you know, means you accept the rights and obligations of the treaty. In this case, the right to enter, for example, to enter a new market, to be given access to a new market, the obligation to open your own markets, the obligation to open your investment markets, and similarly in the area of services, where the focus is on eliminating regulatory barriers to services trade. So we are now in the mode of implementation of the agreement. We've shifted from negotiations. We concluded all of the negotiations of the protocols in less than 5 years, and we are now in full implementation mode with trading happening across the continent on the basis of the preferences and the rules of the AfCFTA.
And I know in 2021, we were actually privileged to host you at the Wilson Center as part of our Brown Capital Management Africa Forum, where you gave our first biannual lecture. And at that event, you had actually mentioned that you're coming to the US. That was your first international trip since you were appointed Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I know a lot has changed since then, and it'd be good to get your sense about why you see the US as being important to helping with intra-African trade, and how do you see US trade and African countries evolving, especially at this time and this moment where we are today?
We've shared the belief that trade must benefit everybody, particularly small, medium enterprises, young people, and women-led businesses and that the benefits of trade must not accrue only to large corporations. And that was the basis of our memorandum of understanding, which we signed with the USTR. And so that was a start to a very good collaboration with the USTR at that time. Of course, the world is a very different place now. And so the question for us as Africans is, how do we navigate? Well, I think the way for us to navigate that is to consolidate the domestic market in Africa. And by that, I mean the AfCFTA, to accelerate its implementation. There may be countries that are much slower than others. Of course, the continent of Africa, the AfCFTA comprises 48 state parties, as I said earlier. And so we've got to move very, very fast to create a market that is significant enough, 1.4 billion people, with a combined purchasing power parity GDP of $6.8 trillion. So it is a significant market that does enable the self-sufficiency of the African continent in the context where we see these geo-economic tensions. But for Africa is an opportunity to accelerate our ambitions for creating a domestic market.
Let me jump in here. In the 5 years that you have been implementing the AfCFTA, which sectors have you seen show the first signs of response? And regions, countries, where should we be looking for the early signs of progress?
We're seeing the services sector moving very rapidly, which is very encouraging. So, for example, Access Bank, a Nigerian bank, has just acquired an asset in South Africa, very substantial asset, by the way. We are seeing also a lot of interest in the financial services sector in general, but in particular, banking in Ethiopia. Moving into Ethiopia, we're seeing also the telecoms sector being interested in expanding into new markets on the back of the AfCFTA. In fact, many governments that are advancing their economic reforms, far-reaching economic reforms, are doing so in part because they've undertaken the obligations of the AfCFTA, which is Africa's #1 reform agenda. So perhaps we should not have been surprised, but it is the services sector that is moving relatively fast. Manufacturing and trade in goods, manufacturing sector is, of course, subject to infrastructure constraints, transport and logistics constraints. They are a very significant factor in how fast or slow they make use of the agreement. But in general, I'm satisfied that in the short space of time that we've been implementing this, we've made good progress. We've got a long way to go, of course, but in a short space of time, we've made very, very good progress.
And can you just comment on how the digital protocol has worked with the expansion of services in the region?
The AfCFTA protocol on digital trade is actually the first of its kind around the world. There is no other legal instrument around the world that is as comprehensive and that provides such a comprehensive regulatory framework for the digital economy. You do get in NAFTA, you get some provisions there that speak to the digital economy. And if you look at also the trade arrangement in ASEAN, they've got some provisions. We've taken a different approach. We've told ourselves that we're going to have a comprehensive, ambitious, and far-reaching set of provisions on to anchor Africa's digital economy. So some of the provisions include payments, enabling a seamless, interoperable continental payments system, and being technology neutral and player neutral, so that any private sector entity or central bank can take advantage of this significant market and establish a payments capability. We've also ensured that there's no longer a prohibition on the movement of data across borders, except, of course, in relation to security. The private sector is interested in commercial data, and EcoBank being able to move their commercial data from Mozambique to Lome, where they are headquartered. And so the ability to move data really is in sync with the direction of the digital economy. We also have provisions that prohibit the localization of computing services because we want to encourage digital public infrastructure to be established, investors to come and invest in Africa's digital public infrastructure. And so with that goal, it does not make sense to limit computing services to a particular jurisdiction. So we are trying to create a single digital marketplace by this protocol, and it has been very well received by small technology and big tech, and it is forward-looking. It positions the continent of Africa for competitiveness in the global economy. A study indicated that Africa by the year 2035 will require over 700 data centers as the digital economy continues to grow. We already see this happening in Nigeria, in Rwanda, in Kenya. In May, Cabo Verde will launch the largest data center on the African continent. And they are doing so hoping to position themselves as a small island economy, but to focus on the services sector. So I think this legal instrument not only will enable inclusion through some of the provisions in it that relate to small medium enterprises, digital skills development. Inclusion is at the heart, as I said earlier, of what we're trying to achieve, but it will also enable the continent of Africa to develop its own technology platforms so that we don't stream everything that we get in Africa or use platforms that are outside of Africa, that take revenue outside of Africa. We want to welcome global investors, but welcome them to invest in Africa and to establish a commercial presence in Africa, whether it is through investing in infrastructure, in digital infrastructure, and see commercially priced returns on their investment. Or if indeed it is partnering with governments to build digital public infrastructure. So I'm very excited about this protocol.
This is really impressive. I'm getting really excited hearing you talk about this. So I appreciate that you're really excited about this new initiative. And, you've spoken a lot about how the AfCFTA can help to advance African industrialization. And one of the comments that I've often heard you make is about ensuring that products are true made in Africa products, not just product finalization. So I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit. What needs to be done to make headway towards ensuring that African industrialization and manufacturing really benefits the African people to really achieving that vision of truly made in Africa products?
We've got to do three things. Two of them were already on track. First, we have to implement Africa's industrialization strategy. So the policy is there. It was adopted. We set out a strategy for Africa's industrialization, focusing on key sectors of economic growth. The backbone of Africa's economy, agriculture and agro-processing, the value addition of minerals, processing of minerals in Africa. This is all part of our industrial development strategy. The second component, which is important, is trade policy. We now have trade policy, the trade rules, the AfCFTA, that enable us to develop a market for that industrialization and the production that happens in that industrialization strategy. These are relatively, and I use the word relatively advisedly, these are relatively easy to achieve. The third and most important and probably more difficult component is investing in that industrialization. And this is where our development finance institutions have a very, very important role to play. Afrexim Bank, AFDB, Africa Finance Corporation, Africa 50, and other regional development finance institutions so that they leverage their balance sheet for risk mitigation to enable investment in Africa's manufacturing capability. For example, the Dangote Group have built successfully one of the world's, if not the largest refinery in the world, so that the processing happens in Africa and that Africa begins to export processed commodities, petroleum in this case, and export it within the AfCFTA market. That took a very significant determination by our development finance institutions to invest in that refinery. So the three components are absolutely key and are complementary. You develop an industrialization strategy, you implement it along with a trade policy, and then the development finance that is required to invest must certainly be there. I am most grateful that we do see progress in this regard. There are a number of projects on the continent where our development finance institutions have stepped up and have provided the investment that is required for us to take advantage of this significant market.
Great. Let me just shift to the complementarity between AGOA and AfCFTA. As you know, AGOA is set to expire at the end of September this year. From your vantage point, what needs to be done to AGOA to ensure that it's working hand in hand with the implementation of the AfCFTA?
With the previous administration, we had come to an agreement during the most recent AGOA forum. The US, the African Union, and ourselves, we had agreed that AGOA should not contribute to Africa's fragmentation. There are those who are in, there are those who are out. How do we make sure that AGOA supports regional continental integration in Africa? So we have North African countries that are not in AGOA. So how do we develop tools that, as much as North African countries are not in AGOA, that will still, at the very least, support the implementation of the AfCFTA and not cause fragmentation? So we had agreed, and we had made very, very good progress in that regard. Second, we had agreed that the trade rules, such as investment, competition, must be aligned. Whatever trade rules on the new generation issues, whatever trade rules are agreed to, they must be aligned with the AfCFTA. And I thought that that was a very, very sensible way to proceed. Going forward, I really do not know what is going to happen. But whatever happens, regardless of the path that the new administration takes, and Senate and Congress, I think that the baseline should be the AfCFTA. The rules that we already have, which, by the way, cover areas of interest of US companies, investment protection, intellectual property rights, protection of intellectual property rights, a dispute settlement function that is credible. All of these things, after the digital economy that we just talked about, all of these things, US investors have an interest in. And so the task will be easier this time around as opposed to 25 years ago, because we have a baseline of rules that we can invoke those rules in any negotiation to set out the parameters so that we don't move backwards and so that we don't contribute to fragmentation and reversal of the gains that we've made through the AfCFTA.
One of the most important dynamics over the last decade is how competitive the African market has become and how many partners have come forward recognizing the opportunity there. And I think when AGOA was first passed, it was passed on the idea of mutual benefit and mutual gain. So hopefully that will be sustained as we go forward.
I hope so. I certainly hope so. That whatever outcome there is, whether it is the continuation of AGOA with some modifications that I've mentioned, that seek to support regional integration, economic integration in Africa, or if we shift towards free trade agreements, I certainly hope that it will continue to be a win-win situation.
With South Africa's presidency of the G20 and looking at the visions that have been set and the visions that have been set through the African Continental Free Trade Area and other African continental bodies too as well, do you see this presidency of the G20 as an opportunity to also advance some of the messages that you've been sharing?
The president of South Africa, when the presidency of the G20 passed on to South Africa, was very clear that this G20 presidency is for the entire continent of Africa. When the heads of states met for their annual summit in Addis Ababa last month, this was welcomed as an opportunity for the entire continent of Africa. I believe South Africa recognizes that the desire for success is not just for South Africans, it is for the entire continent. We have been working together to identify areas of priority. One of them is digitization of Africa's economy. The second, of course, is consistent with the theme for this year, is an economic growth that is equality of opportunity across members of the G20. And of course, the third important aspect is on investment. The continent of Africa making an investment proposition on leveraging on the AfCFTA. The first meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the G20 that was held in Johannesburg last month was a great success. It was very, very encouraging to hear global partners, members of the G20, commit to the themes that South Africa has chosen: the digitalization of the economy, investment and trade, strengthening multilateralism. Every minister who took the floor recommitted his or her country to the theme. So I believe that we will have a successful G20 as the African Union, and in particular as the AfCFTA. We are providing technical support in areas where the African Union and the government of South Africa, where they have requested us to be part of those technical teams.
Thank you so much. 2025 is definitely going to be a very busy year, an exciting year for the African continent. And so thank you for spending this time with us. We're glad that there are people like yourself and others who are leading institutions that are driving these conversations on the continent. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you. And thank you to you also, Whitney. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Beyond the Single Story. As always, a special thanks to the production team that made this series possible. This episode was produced by Aaron Stanley and Nathaniel Oakes. Technical assistance was provided by Sharona Harris, and editing was done by Brian Prevost. The views expressed by guests of the podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Wilson Center Africa Program. The Africa Program is part of the Wilson Center, a congressionally chartered think tank that provides insights on global affairs to policymakers and the public through deep research, impartial analysis, and independent scholarship.